September 1945, Rabaul. Australian soldiers captured a Japanese general whose forces had killed over 8,000 Allied prisoners, yet within weeks, these same soldiers were protecting him from execution and demanding he receive mercy. The evidence they discovered would challenge everything the world believed about enemy commanders in World War II. What could a Japanese general have possibly done to make his captors become his defenders? The tropical air hung thick and heavy as Australian troops moved through the ruined Japanese base. Palm trees swayed in the warm breeze, their leaves rustling softly above the sound of boots crunching on broken concrete and debris. The war in the Pacific was over. Japan had surrendered just weeks before, and now Allied forces were sweeping across the Pacific Islands, accepting the surrender of Japanese troops and beginning the massive task of documenting war crimes. The smell of salt water mixed with smoke from still-burning fires. Birds called from the jungle that surrounded the military compound. And in the middle of this scene stood Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army, responsible for 140,000 Japanese troops spread across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Australian newspapers back home were filled with stories demanding justice. The headlines screamed for vengeance. Over 1,000 Allied prisoners of war had died in areas under Imamura's command. The numbers were staggering and heartbreaking. The Montevideo Maru massacre alone had claimed 1,053 lives, in prisoners and civilians alike, when their prison ship was torpedoed while transporting them. Families across Australia had lost fathers, sons, and brothers. Mothers read the casualty lists and wept. The public wanted someone to pay for these deaths. They wanted the Japanese commanders who had allowed such suffering to face the harshest punishment possible. Captain Paul Piper stood in the command tent, reviewing the files spread across the wooden table before him. Sweat dripped down his face in the humid afternoon heat. Flies buzzed around the tent opening. The reports made for difficult reading. Investigation teams were uncovering atrocities across the entire Pacific Theater. Prison camps where men had starved. Work details where prisoners dropped dead from exhaustion and disease. Guards who beat and tortured captives for the smallest infractions. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. Every senior Japanese commander was being rounded up for trial. The assumption was clear and simple. These men were war criminals. They had commanded forces that committed terrible acts. They would face justice, and that justice would likely mean death. Sentences for most of them. Imamura was no exception to this thinking. His rank made him a prime target for prosecution. As commander of such a vast area, he bore responsibility for everything that happened under his watch. The legal principle was straightforward. A commander is responsible for the actions of his troops. If those troops committed crimes, the commander must answer for those crimes. Military lawyers were already preparing cases against dozens of Japanese generals. The trials would be swift. The evidence was clear. The outcomes seemed certain. But something strange happened during those first interviews with Imamura. Captain Piper noticed it immediately. The general did not make excuses. He did not try to shift blame to subordinates or claim he knew nothing about the treatment of prisoners. Instead, Imamura insisted on taking personal responsibility for everything that had occurred in his command area. He sat straight in his chair, his uniform still neat despite weeks of jungle living after the surrender. His face was weathered and tired, but his eyes were clear. He spoke calmly and directly through the interpreter. Piper had interviewed dozens of Japanese officers by this point. Most of them followed a pattern. They claimed they were just following orders from Tokyo. They said they had no choice. They argued that the harsh treatment of prisoners was required by Japanese military tradition and code. Some even claimed that prisoners deserved poor treatment because they had dishonored themselves by surrendering instead of fighting to the death. These explanations were common, almost universal among captured Japanese officers. They used them to try to reduce their own guilt and responsibility. Imamura said none of these things. When asked about prisoner deaths, he did not deny them or minimize them. He acknowledged that terrible things had happened. He accepted that, as commander, the responsibility fell on his shoulders. But then he said something that made Piper stop and look up from his notes. Imamura stated that he had repeatedly countermanded orders from Tokyo regarding the treatment of prisoners. He claimed he had defied direct commands from imperial headquarters about how prisoners should be handled. This was completely unexpected. Japanese military culture was built on absolute obedience to orders from superiors. The idea that a general would disobey Tokyo was almost unthinkable. Officers who disobeyed orders faced severe punishment, possibly even execution. The chain of command was sacred. Yet here was Imamura calmly stating that he had violated this most basic principle of Japanese military discipline. Piper pressed for details. What orders had been countermanded? When? Why? How? The general began to provide specifics. He mentioned dates, locations, and the names of officers involved. He described decisions he had made about medical supplies, food rations, and camp conditions. He spoke about visiting prison camps personally, and something that other Japanese commanders never did. He talked about court-martials he had ordered for Japanese officers who had mistreated prisoners. The interpreter struggled to keep up with the flow of information. Piper scribbled notes as fast as he could write. This was not what anyone expected to hear. If what Imamura was saying was true, it would change everything about his case. But could it be true? Was this just another clever defense strategy? Perhaps Imamura thought that claiming he had tried to help prisoners would save him from execution. Maybe this was just a story designed to create sympathy and doubt. Piper knew he needed evidence. Stories and claims meant nothing without proof. So he began to dig deeper. He requested access to captured Japanese military documents. He asked for lists of prisoners who had survived camps in Imamura's area. He wanted to interview these former prisoners and ask them what they had witnessed. He needed hard facts, numbers, documents, and testimony that could prove or disprove what Imamura was claiming. The investigation expanded rapidly. Other intelligence officers joined the effort. They sorted through boxes of captured papers, looking for orders, reports, and correspondence. They traveled to former prison campsites, examining the conditions and talking to locals who had observed what happened there. They compiled lists of surviving prisoners and began conducting interviews. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture began to emerge that nobody expected to see. The evidence suggested that Imamura had been telling the truth. What could this Japanese general have possibly done that would make his enemies start to question everything they thought they knew about justice and responsibility? December 1942. 15 months before Imamura's capture, in the middle of the war, something unusual happened at Rabaul. Japanese supply ships arrived carrying medical equipment and medicine destined for Japanese forces fighting across the region. These supplies were desperately needed. Japanese soldiers were dying from disease and infection at alarming rates. Malaria, dengue fever, and tropical infections killed as many men as Allied bullets. Every bandage, every dose of medicine, every bottle of disinfectant was precious and in short supply. Imamura issued an order that shocked his subordinate officers. He directed that 2,400 tons of these medical supplies be diverted from Japanese troops and sent instead to prisoner of war camps. 2,400 tons. That was enough medicine and equipment to treat thousands of men for months. His own officers protested. They argued that Japanese soldiers should receive these supplies first. They reminded the general that their duty was to their own forces, not to enemy prisoners. Some questioned whether the order was even legal under Japanese military law. The general listened to these objections calmly, then repeated his order. The supplies would go to the prisoner camps. He put this order in writing. The document was filed in the headquarters records, stamped with his personal seal. Years later, Australian investigators found this order among captured files. They checked the dates against shipment records. The supplies had indeed been diverted exactly as Imamura commanded. Former prisoners who survived those camps reported that conditions improved noticeably in early 1943. Medicine became available, bandages were distributed, basic medical care became possible where before there had been almost none. But this was not an isolated incident. The investigators kept finding more evidence. In January 1943, Imamura did something that no other Japanese general in the Pacific Theater ever did. He personally visited prisoner of war camps under his command. He walked through the facilities. He spoke with the Japanese guards and camp commanders. He observed the conditions with his own eyes. His own diary, confiscated after his surrender and later translated, contained entries describing these visits. The general wrote that he was disturbed by what he saw. The prisoners were thin and weak. Many were sick. The camps lacked basic sanitation. He wrote that this violated his sense of proper conduct, even toward enemies. After these visits, Imamura issued new written protocols for prisoner treatment. These documents spelled out specific rules. Prisoners must receive adequate food. Medical care must be provided when possible. Physical beatings were prohibited except as formal punishment for specific violations of camp rules. The protocols even specified minimum space requirements per prisoner and requirements for clean water access. Australian investigators found 23 separate documented instances where Imamura issued orders that directly contradicted the harsh approach that Tokyo headquarters was demanding. The evidence became even more compelling when investigators began interviewing former prisoners. They compiled a list of men who had survived camps in Imamura's command area and were now back in Australia or other Allied countries. 47 of these former prisoners provided testimony. Their stories were remarkably consistent. Many described moments when conditions suddenly improved for no obvious reason. Food rations increased slightly. Medicine appeared. Guards became less brutal. Some prisoners remembered specific incidents where Japanese officers intervened to stop mistreatment. One former Australian prisoner named Thomas recalled an event from March 1943. A Japanese guard had been beating prisoners regularly, using any excuse to inflict punishment. The beatings were severe enough that several men had been hospitalized. Then one day, the guard simply disappeared. The prisoners later learned from other guards that the man had been arrested, court-martialed, and sent back to Japan in disgrace. This pattern repeated multiple times. Investigators documented 8 separate cases where Imamura had Japanese officers court-martialed specifically for mistreating prisoners. Major General Horace Robertson received these investigation reports in early 1946. Robertson was a tough Australian commander who had fought across the Pacific. He had lost men under his command. He had seen the results of Japanese brutality firsthand. Nobody expected him to show mercy to enemy generals. But Robertson was also a careful and thoughtful officer. He believed in following evidence wherever it led. He spent weeks reviewing the investigation files. He read every document, every testimony, every piece of evidence that had been collected. Then Robertson did something controversial. He wrote an official recommendation stating that Imamura should receive consideration for demonstrated humanity. The recommendation ran 127 pages, meticulously documenting every piece of evidence. Robertson argued that while Imamura bore command responsibility for terrible events that occurred in his area, he had also made genuine efforts to prevent cruelty and improve prisoner treatment. This made him different from other Japanese commanders who had either encouraged brutality or turned a blind eye to it. The military tribunal initially rejected this recommendation completely. The officers reviewing the case were skeptical. They suspected this might be some clever defense trick. They worried about public reaction if a senior Japanese general received lenient treatment. Australian families who had lost loved ones would be outraged. Politicians would ask difficult questions. The newspapers would attack anyone who showed mercy to the enemy. The safer path was to group Imamura with all the other Japanese generals and recommend a harsh sentence. But Robertson refused to back down. He insisted that the tribunal review his full report. He personally presented the evidence at multiple hearings. He brought in former prisoners to testify about their experiences. He showed the captured Japanese documents with Imamura's orders and seals. He demonstrated the timeline of how conditions improved in certain camps after Imamura's interventions. The presentation took days. Robertson methodically built his case, fact by fact, document by document, testimony by testimony. The turning point came when one of the tribunal officers asked a simple question. If Imamura had done nothing to help prisoners, how many more would have died? Robertson had prepared for this question. He presented an analysis comparing death rates in camps where Imamura's orders had been implemented versus camps where they had been ignored or where other Japanese commanders were in charge. The difference was significant. Based on statistical modeling, Robertson estimated that Imamura's interventions had saved between 4,000 and 6,000 Allied lives. 4,000 to 6,000. Those numbers hung in the air of the tribunal room. That was thousands of fathers, sons, and brothers who came home instead of dying in jungle prison camps. Those were thousands of families who were reunited instead of receiving death notifications. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Yet even with this evidence, the tribunal struggled with the decision. How could they explain mercy for a Japanese general when so many prisoners had still died under his command? How could they balance the good actions against the terrible outcomes that still occurred? In February 1946, Imamura's trial began at Rabaul. The proceedings were formal and proper. Evidence was presented by both prosecutors and defenders. Witnesses testified. Documents were entered into the record. The general sat quietly through most of the trial, speaking only when directly asked questions. He never tried to minimize what had happened. He acknowledged every death that occurred in his command area. He accepted responsibility as the commander, but he also truthfully described the actions he had taken to try to improve conditions within the limits of his authority and resources. The verdict came after 3 weeks of testimony. Imamura was found guilty of command responsibility for war crimes that occurred in his area. The sentence was 10 years imprisonment, not death, not life imprisonment, 10 years. The sentence acknowledged both his guilt and his efforts at humanity. He would serve his time at Manus Island Prison, a military facility run by Australian forces. The guards there received unusual orders. They were told to treat Imamura with military respect, not as a common criminal. This respectful treatment would become important because what happened next would surprise everyone even more. The reaction back in Australia was immediate and angry. Within days of the sentence being announced, Australian newspapers ran headlines that screamed betrayal. One Sydney paper declared, "Japanese general receives 5-star treatment while our boys died in his camps." Radio commentators questioned how military authorities could be so soft on a war criminal. Letters poured into government offices. Members of Parliament received angry calls from families who had lost loved ones in the Pacific. The public mood was clear. People wanted justice, and to them, justice meant harsh punishment, not 10 years in prison with respectful treatment. The contrast with other Japanese commanders was stark and impossible to ignore. Across the Pacific, war crimes trials were concluding with death sentences. 920 senior Japanese officers faced execution for their roles in wartime atrocities. These men had commanded forces that committed terrible crimes against prisoners and civilians. They were being hanged or shot by firing squad. Their trials were brief. The evidence against them was overwhelming. There was no public sympathy, no mercy, no consideration of mitigating factors. They had done terrible things, and they paid with their lives. Yet Imamura, who commanded 140,000 troops across a vast area where over 8,000 Allied prisoners and civilians had died, received only a prison sentence. He became one of just 43 senior Japanese commanders to receive prison terms instead of execution. The difference seemed impossible to justify to people who had lost family members. How could the military explain this disparity? What made Imamura different from all those other generals who were executed? The protests grew louder and more organized. Families of deceased prisoners formed groups and organized demonstrations. They gathered outside military headquarters in Melbourne, holding photographs of their lost loved ones. Some carried signs demanding that Imamura's sentence be reviewed and changed to execution. One mother whose son had died on the Sandakan death march confronted a military spokesman directly. She asked how they could explain this mercy to her when her boy had suffered so terribly. Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke. Reporters captured the moment on camera. The image appeared in newspapers across the country. Politicians saw an opportunity. Several members of Parliament demanded a formal review of the sentence. They gave speeches questioning the military tribunal's judgment. They suggested that someone had been corrupted or fooled by clever Japanese lies. They demanded access to all the evidence that had led to this unusual decision. The pressure was intense and growing stronger each day. Military authorities found themselves defending a decision that seemed indefensible to much of the public. But the evidence that had convinced Major General Robertson and the tribunal was solid and extensive. Investigators had found clear documentation of Imamura's actions. The captured Japanese military records told a consistent story. In December 1942, he diverted those 2,400 tons of medical supplies. In January 1943, he visited prisoner camps personally. Throughout 1943 and 1944, he issued orders requiring better treatment. he court-martialed 8 Japanese officers for prisoner abuse. These were facts, not opinions or interpretations. The documents existed. They had been verified. Former prisoners confirmed the results of these actions. Yet counter-evidence existed too, and it was equally damning. The Montevideo Maru massacre happened in waters under Imamura's command responsibility. 1,053 prisoners and civilians died when that ship was torpedoed. The Sandakan death marches occurred in his command area. 641 Australian prisoners died on those terrible forced marches through the jungle. Only 6 men survived Sandakan out of the thousands who had been imprisoned there. Those 6 survivors told stories of unimaginable suffering, starvation, disease, and deliberate cruelty. How could any good actions balance against such massive loss of life? The moral complexity was genuine and painful. Imamura had tried to improve conditions, but thousands still died. He had saved some lives, but failed to save many more. He had defied some of Tokyo's cruel orders, but followed others. He was neither completely guilty nor completely innocent. He existed in a gray area that made people deeply uncomfortable. Everyone wanted simple answers, clear villains, and heroes. Imamura fit neither category cleanly. At Manus Island Prison, far from the controversy raging in Australian cities, Imamura began serving his sentence. The prison sat on a small tropical island north of Papua New Guinea. The climate was hot and humid year-round. Temperatures regularly reached 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Rain fell frequently, heavy, tropical downpours that turned the prison grounds muddy and slick. The sound of rain drumming on corrugated iron roofs was constant during the wet season. At night, insects buzzed and chirped in the darkness. The ocean was visible from the prison, blue water stretching to the horizon. Most prisoners at Manus Island were housed in basic barracks. The buildings were simple structures with metal roofs, concrete floors, and walls that let air flow through but provided little comfort. The heat was oppressive, especially during the day. Men sweated constantly. Drinking water was rationed. Food was basic but adequate. Prison life was meant to be punishment, not comfort. But Imamura's treatment was different. He was given a small separate area where he could maintain a vegetable garden. He received paper and writing materials. He was allowed time for meditation and quiet reflection. Guards reported that he spent hours each day sitting in silence, sometimes facing the direction of Japan, sometimes facing the prison chapel. He wrote constantly, filling page after page with careful handwriting. When guards asked what he was writing, he explained that he was composing letters of apology to Allied families who had lost loved ones in his command area. The guards found this behavior strange and unexpected. They were watching a man who could have been executed but was instead given a chance at eventual freedom. Most prisoners in his position would have felt relieved, perhaps even fortunate. They would have served their time quietly and gratefully, but Imamura seemed burdened by something heavier than his sentence. He carried guilt that the tribunal had not imposed. He felt responsibility that went beyond what the law required. Then in 1950, 5 years into his sentence, Imamura did something that shocked everyone involved with his case. He submitted a formal written request to the prison authorities. The request was unusual enough that it was forwarded up the chain of command until it reached senior military officers. Imamura was asking that his sentence be extended voluntarily. He wanted more time in prison. His reasoning was carefully explained in the document. He believed that as commander, he should serve time for every soldier under his command who had committed atrocities against prisoners. He had calculated the number of proven cases where Japanese troops had killed or severely mistreated Allied prisoners. He estimated the appropriate additional punishment. His calculation came to 23 more years beyond his original 10-year sentence. He was asking to spend a total of 33 years in prison, which would keep him imprisoned until he was an old man, possibly for the rest of his life. The prison authorities did not know how to respond to this request. Nothing in military law or prison regulations covered such a situation. Prisoners did not ask for longer sentences. They appealed for shorter ones, for parole, for early release, not for more time locked up. Some officials suspected this might be some sort of trick or manipulation. Perhaps Imamura thought this gesture would make him look good and actually result in earlier release. Maybe he was trying to create sympathy. But those who interacted with Imamura regularly believed he was completely sincere. The guards who watched him every day reported that he seemed genuinely tormented by the suffering that had occurred under his command. His letters of apology were heartfelt and detailed. He expressed remorse that seemed deep and real. He made no excuses for what had happened. He did not blame subordinates or circumstances. He accepted full moral responsibility even beyond what the law required. After several weeks of consideration, Australian military authorities denied Imamura's request for extended imprisonment. The decision stated that the tribunal had already determined the appropriate sentence based on all relevant factors. Extending that sentence at the prisoner's request would serve no purpose. It would not bring back the dead. It would not undo the suffering. It would simply keep an aging man in prison beyond what justice required. The matter was closed, but the request itself had an impact beyond its denial. News of it leaked to the press. Newspapers that had condemned Imamura's light sentence now reported this strange development. The public reaction was mixed and confused. Some people said this proved Imamura was truly remorseful. Others argued it was obviously a manipulation, a clever way to look good. Still others simply did not know what to think. The simple narrative of Japanese generals as uncaring war criminals became more complicated. The story did not fit the expected pattern anymore. By this time, the full scale of Imamura's impact was becoming clearer through continued investigation. Odd researchers estimated that his orders and interventions had saved between 4,000 and 6,000 Allied prisoners from death. That number was based on comparing survival rates in camps where his orders were implemented versus camps where they were not. The difference was statistically significant. Thousands of men came home to their families because Imamura had defied Tokyo and insisted on better treatment for prisoners. Yet those same statistics showed that over 8,000 prisoners and civilians had died in his command area. The Sandakan Death March claimed 641 Australian lives. The Montevideo Maru took 1,053 more. Smaller incidents and camp deaths added thousands more to the toll. These deaths happened on his watch. They were his responsibility as commander. No amount of good actions could erase these losses. The prisoners who survived had complicated feelings about their former captor. Some expressed gratitude that conditions had improved when they did. Others felt that any improvement came too late to save their friends who had already died. Some survivors said that Imamura deserved credit for trying to do right in impossible circumstances. Others insisted that he deserved no credit for doing the bare minimum of treating prisoners like human beings. Both perspectives had validity. Both came from men who had suffered terribly. What was clear was that this case had established something new in how war crimes were prosecuted. Before Imamura, the approach was simple. A commander was responsible for his troops' actions. If his troops committed crimes, he was guilty. Period. But Imamura's case introduced nuance. It said that a commander's own actions and efforts mattered. Good actions did not erase guilt, but they could be considered alongside the bad. Justice could be complex rather than simple. This was a significant shift in how military law thought about command responsibility. Imamura was released from prison in 1954 after serving 8 years of his 10-year sentence. He received early release for good behavior, a standard practice for model prisoners. He was 64 years old. His hair was white. His body was thinner than it had been during the war. He moved slowly, like a man older than his years. The tropical climate and prison conditions had taken their toll on his health. Upon his release, Imamura faced a choice. He could return to Japan and attempt to rebuild some kind of life. Many former military officers were doing this. Japan was recovering from the war. The economy was starting to grow again. There were opportunities for men with education and organizational skills, even former generals. He could have found a quiet job, lived out his remaining years with dignity, perhaps even written his memoirs. This was the path most other released officers followed. Imamura chose differently. He refused to return to normal life in Japan. Instead, he traveled back to Rabaul, to the site where he had surrendered 9 years earlier. He built a small hut near where the prison had stood. The structure was simple, made from local wood and palm fronds. It had a sleeping mat, a small table, and little else. He lived there in conditions that were deliberately harsh and uncomfortable. The heat was oppressive. Rain leaked through the roof. Insects were constant companions. He owned almost nothing. Local people who lived near Rabaul were confused by this strange Japanese man living alone in a hut. Some remembered the war and the Japanese occupation. They were suspicious at first, but Imamura made no trouble. He bothered no one. He grew vegetables in a small garden. He spent his days in meditation and writing. He spoke little. When asked why he lived this way, he explained that he was seeking forgiveness. He believed he needed to suffer more for what had happened under his command. Imamura lived in that hut for 6 years, from 1954 to 1960. He was entirely alone except for occasional visitors. Some former Australian soldiers who had served as guards at Manus Island came to see him. These visits were remarkable. Here were men who had been enemies during the war, then jailer and prisoner, now sitting together as something close to friends. The former guards brought food and supplies. They talked about their lives, their families, what they were doing now that the war was long past. They shared an unusual bond, a connection formed through years of daily interaction in the prison. One of these former guards, a man named William, later wrote letters about his visits to Imamura's hut. William described feeling a mixture of sadness and respect. He wrote that Imamura seemed to be punishing himself more harshly than any court could have. The general insisted on living in poverty and isolation when he could have had comfort and society. William wrote that Imamura told him that until he felt he had properly atoned for the deaths in his command area, he could not allow himself any peace or pleasure. In 1960, Imamura's health began failing seriously. He was 70 years old. The years of harsh living had weakened his body. He was persuaded to return to Japan for medical treatment. He moved to Tokyo and lived with relatives who cared for him, but he never resumed any kind of public life. He gave no interviews. He attended no military reunions. He wrote no memoirs. He remained silent and withdrawn, still seeking a forgiveness that he felt would never fully come. Imamura died in 1968 at age 78. His death received little notice. Newspapers in Japan printed small obituaries mentioning his rank and service during the war. Australian papers barely mentioned it at all. He had become a footnote, a minor character in the larger story of World War II in the Pacific. Most people had forgotten about the unusual case of the Japanese general who tried to help prisoners and was protected by his captors. But his case lived on in military law. The Imamura precedent, as legal scholars began calling it, established important principles that are still used today. It demonstrated that command responsibility is not absolute and automatic. A commander's own actions matter. Efforts to prevent crimes or reduce suffering can be considered alongside failures to stop all wrongdoing. This concept became part of the 1949 Geneva Convention discussions. The treaty language about command responsibility was shaped partly by lessons learned from cases like Imamura's. Later, war crimes tribunals referenced the Imamura case when dealing with similar situations. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s cited it when considering the cases of military commanders who had tried but failed to prevent all atrocities by their troops. The International Criminal Court uses similar reasoning today. The principle is now established in international law. A commander has a duty to prevent war crimes. If he makes genuine efforts to fulfill that duty but does not succeed completely, this matters in determining his guilt and punishment. The letters from the Australian guards who knew Imamura began emerging in the 1970s as historians researched the Pacific War. These letters revealed something important about how prolonged contact between enemies can change perceptions. William wrote that guarding Imamura taught him that enemies could have honor. Another former guard named Robert wrote that watching Imamura's daily struggle with guilt and remorse showed him that conscience existed even in the enemy. These men had expected to hate their Japanese prisoner. Instead, they came to respect his integrity even while acknowledging his failures. This complicated the post-war relationship between Australia and Japan. Simple narratives of good versus evil became harder to maintain when people learned about cases like Imamura. The story did not fit the expected pattern. It forced people to think about war in more complex terms. Japanese military culture had produced both terrible cruelty and individual acts of conscience. Allied military justice had proved capable of both harsh punishment and nuanced judgment. The real story was messier than anyone wanted to admit. Modern military law continues to wrestle with the questions raised by Imamura's case. How much responsibility does a commander bear for actions he did not directly order or approve? If a commander tries to prevent crimes but lacks the power or resources to stop everything, how guilty is he? If a commander saves some lives but fails to save others, how should we weigh these outcomes against each other? These questions have no easy answers. They require careful consideration of specific facts and circumstances in each case. The concept of degrees of guilt remains controversial today. Some people argue that guilt is absolute. If you commanded forces that committed crimes, you are guilty, period. Mitigating factors should not matter. Others argue that context always matters. A commander who tried to do right in difficult circumstances is different from one who encouraged cruelty or ignored it. Both perspectives have merit. The tension between them continues in modern war crimes prosecution. What made Imamura's case truly unusual was not just his actions during the war, but his response afterward. Most people, when facing guilt for terrible events, seek ways to minimize their responsibility. They blame others, cite mitigating circumstances, argue they had no choice. Imamura did the opposite. He expanded his sense of responsibility beyond what anyone asked of him. He insisted on accepting guilt even for actions of subordinates that he had tried to prevent. This kind of total moral responsibility is rare. The Australian soldiers who protected Imamura from execution were not betraying their fallen comrades. They were refusing to let justice become simple vengeance. They examined evidence carefully. They made difficult distinctions between different types and degrees of guilt. They acknowledged that even an enemy could try to do right. This took moral courage. It would have been easier and safer to treat all Japanese generals the same way, to ignore evidence that complicated the simple narrative of good versus evil. In protecting Imamura, these Australians demonstrated something more powerful than revenge. They showed that justice requires thought, not just anger. They proved that even after terrible losses and suffering, it is possible to examine evidence fairly and make nuanced judgments. They displayed the strength to recognize complexity even in the enemy. True strength is not the capacity for cruelty. It is the wisdom to be just when it would be easier to be ruthless. The story teaches us that honor can exist on both sides of a conflict. Imamura tried to do right within a system that encouraged wrong. The Australian investigators and tribunal members insisted on fair treatment even when the public demanded harsh punishment. Both sides rose above what would have been easy to do, what they believed was right. This is the real meaning of honor. War brings out the worst in human nature, but it can also reveal the best. Imamura showed that conscience can survive even in the midst of total war. The Australians who protected him showed that justice can survive even in the face of tremendous loss and anger. Both lessons remain relevant today. We still fight wars, we still prosecute war crimes, we still struggle with questions about guilt, responsibility, and punishment. Perhaps the deepest lesson is this: complexity is uncomfortable but necessary. The world rarely divides cleanly into heroes and villains. Most people exist in the gray areas between. We want simple stories with clear morals. We want obvious villains we can punish without doubt. We want heroes who never fail or compromise. But real human beings are more complicated than this. Real justice must account for that complexity. Imamura saved thousands of lives and failed to save thousands more. The Australians who captured him could have executed him easily and faced no criticism. Instead, they examined evidence, acknowledged difficult truths, and made a judgment that honored both justice and mercy. Neither side was perfect. Both sides demonstrated something important about human capability for both good and evil. In the end, the most important choice was not Imamura's decision to help some prisoners. It was the Australian decision to recognize that choice and give it weight despite overwhelming pressure to do otherwise. That took courage. That took integrity. That took a commitment to justice that went beyond emotion and anger. Those qualities remain as rare and valuable today as they were in 1946. The question for us is whether we can demonstrate the same courage when faced with similar complexity in our own time.